Okay, the JLJ is back with Gary Morgenstein, who is play A Black and White Cookie is about to start at the Tank. And we're here just to kind of see what's the genesis for this play at this point, at this time, and to probably talk a little bit about craft and how to construct a play and then how to get it actually put on, which is a feat in and of itself. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm delighted to be here. A Black and White Cookie finally opens in New York City after being postponed from our original production in March 2020 by COVID. We opened July 9th to 24th at the Tank. And it's a play which looks at modern anti-Semitism as one of the bases, as the key to other kinds of prejudices. So often plays about anti-Semitism now are just, they fulfill a political narrative. Everything, it's all the belief that the only anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is from the far right, if only that was true, but it's not. And so I wanted to use, and also dramatically, when you write a play and you just want, as soon as the Nazi goose steps on stage, that's kind of, you kind of know what their story growth is and their character growth, which is nothing. So what I wanted to do is take modern anti-Semitism and look at it as what happens when good people are prejudiced. Because I'm not worried about the fanatics on either side. History has shown us they're not the ones who ultimately succeed. What succeeds are the people, the decent people who look away, who say, well, you know how those people are, or you people, and that's it. And so anti-Semitism, as perhaps humanity's oldest disease in terms of hatred, opens the door through the unlikely friendship between a gruff conservative African-American named Harold Wilson, who finally, a senior, who finally reopens his newsstand in the East Village after the shutdown, only to get hit by an exorbitant rent increase, and he has to close. So enter his eccentric, let's say, Meshuggah, longtime customer, Albie Sands, who's a 1960s style communist Jew who persuades him to fight back. So there are things they must overcome. Anti-Semitism is one of those things, and they show that there is more that unites us than divides us, and I think that's really important. Now it's easy, we live in a society where everyone's young, and there's just polarization and accusations, and when you go into the concept of prejudice, it's a third rail, of course, because there's so much now in our society that we can't touch. You can't explain, for example, more often than not, why something happened without being accused of agreeing. Well, no, I'm just trying to understand. I mean, yelling is farce, but listening, that's drama. And when you talk about prejudice, you can show why people are prejudiced, but you don't have to agree with it. But we have to understand why this happens so we can communicate better.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you're talking about sort of how it was supposed to open in March, but now obviously it's opening now, almost 2 years later. So it's interesting that I assume that the detail about that there was a shutdown was added during the COVID shutdown versus originally perhaps how it was sort of incited. So that's an interesting idea around how context can shift a work, even though it was quote unquote done, let's say 2 years ago, how we can update works across time. It's also interesting in the sense of do you see a difference now in terms of how the piece might come across on the theme of anti-Semitism now versus perhaps March of 2020 and how it might kind of affect people differently?
Well, the question is, how much do people care about? And I think that's a legitimate question. When we first were going to open, and when I was telling the producers, I said, well, we should talk about anti-Semitism. They said, no, you'll drive people away from coming to see it. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, you can't talk about that. And I found that in other works. For example, I had a play, A Tomato Can't Grow in the Bronx, which opened in New Jersey. And it's about a working class, Bronx Jewish family in 1968. And don't say that they're Jewish working class, but they are. No, because then people will think, well, it's only for Jews. Well, wait a minute. Great example. Would anyone dare say, well, you can't do something about a working class Black family or a Hispanic family? I mean, would anyone? So there's a way Jews are viewed differently. And I had these comments from Jews, and that's something to remember. So yes, anti-Semitism is worse than it was in 2020. New York State, in a country which set a record for anti-Semitic hate crimes, New York State ranks #1. And people, well, it must be those yahoos in the Catskills. Well, no, because 60% of the anti-Semitic acts in the state are in New York City. So the question is, so I was not focusing purely on anti-Semitism. I was saying, okay, let's look at how that opens it up to how all you people, those people, because as soon as you say, Aaron, you people, well, I've delegitimized you. For whatever reason, I'm saying you people, and it's a lot of boxes to check up how people could be delegitimized, and that makes it easier to discriminate against, to abuse you. And so I wanted to show that sort of thing. But when you talk about the pandemic, yes, I'm not that prophetic. and when the place shut down, and I was like, oh, what? What? So then the following January 21, I said, all right, enough of this whining. It's not in my nature. I'm going to do Zooms. I'm going to get the play out there. And I looked at the play and I thought, well, wait a minute. How can I not address the pandemic on many levels, on making it contemporary to making it true, to things like there's a scene where one of the characters has what he says is sinusitis. And the original production, it would have been, all right, you'll get better. But now, are you really sure you have that? Have you been tested? It's a whole different thing. Are you vaccinated? How many vaccines do you have? So it's a lot of different things that I had to layer in. It made it a better play, frankly. But yes, it's organic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about sort of, you're not the first person who I've dealt with now with theater where they sort of transition to a Zoom theater experience. And I'm curious as to that versus sitting in a theater, how that shifts perhaps the artwork itself. Do you think it's not as good? Do you think you have to create something new, different? Or how do you see that sort of interacting with how you construct a play?
Well, I had never done Zoom before. I think as other zillion people. I hate to say something where more than 5 million people have died, there's a silver lining, but it is inherent to the human nature to survive somehow. And what Zoom did was enable artists around the world to connect. So I had 5 Zoom production readings of the play from the UK to Los Angeles to Washington. So I met people, and some people who worked on Zoom. Russell Jordan, who is the lead in A Black and White Cookie, he did 2 Zoom readings. So of the play. Rosalind Seal, who was supposed to be in the original production, and she's back as Carol Wilson, his niece, was in a Zoom production. Now, Zoom obviously has limitations. You can't hear anyone say author. That's, let's, talk about important things. But you don't see people's legs, you don't have props, you don't have the intimacy of theater. So nothing's going to beat theater when you come down to it. But Zoom is important to get it out there. And so audiences in England saw the play, and I think Los Angeles. So I think there's something to be said for that. I think theater has often lagged behind other entertainment industries in terms of not embracing the future, or at least even the present and the digital era. And I think Zoom showed that we can do that.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of the medium of how, in some ways, if you were in the 1500s and you're in 2022, it's really the same kind of experience of, you sit there and there's a stage and you're just viewing the thing. So it is interesting to think about how does the technology shift an art form, or how can an art form adopt technology, perhaps even create something new and different. It's interesting you're talking about New York as sort of perhaps an epicenter of anti-Semitism, whereas most people sort of see it as maybe a haven of Jews to a degree. So do you think that the story is a quintessential New York story? Do you think it's sort of New York is a backdrop to your story, or how do you sort of see the city itself within your work?
Well, New York City is definitely a backdrop to it, but it's about people. It's about 2 people who don't think they have anything in common. Two lonely people, two broken people, two hurting people who find that they do. And they have a path and a journey. And I think that's universal. I think we're all reaching for people. Even before COVID, you want to talk about the impact of technology. I think society, all societies, have become so siloed because of social media. And, oh, you didn't answer my text in 8 seconds, so aren't you my friend anymore? Stuff like, all that doesn't promote human contact. And I think the beauty of theater, live in-person theater, is the immediacy, as you say, as it was back in Shakespeare's time, the ancient Greeks. I mean, there's something wonderful about the tradition of theater. I think we need to reach more people. And I think Zoom did that. Because of cost, because of pure geography and access. I think a new generation who embraces Zoom and understands this came to theater. And again, it's not what it should be, but I think it's really important. And I think nothing is like doing stories about people that you can identify with. I think that is also what separates theater, for example, often from movies, especially nowadays, when CGI is used as often as not to replace storyline and characters. So we have like a 25-minute fight scene in a Marvel superhero movie, okay? And no one's hurt, really? Okay, yeah, but theater, there's no, all right, you have the big Hollywood productions and Spider-Man Return, all that, Lion King. But for the most part, it is like you describe it. It is just people on stage who you feel, and you want to see yourself in their stories. And that's what, nothing beats sitting there in the theater. Except now, of course, if people wear masks, can you hear them laugh? The play finally opened outside New York in October at the Silver Spring stage. For a weekend, it got shortened by Omicron. And then it got postponed 2 weeks because one of the actresses was exposed to COVID. Her father was ill. And I remember sitting there and thinking, oh, no one likes it because of the masks, because you can't hear the laughter. That's the neurotic playwright talking. But it's still there's the connection.
Yeah. So walk me through how one, we have a lot of people at JLJ who are our writers. That's primarily who we're. Walk me through like the process of genesis of a play to production on a stage. How does that look? Obviously, I'm sure there's multiple ways that it can get there, but for this one, how did that look? Sort of the steps.
Well, the play just came to me. I was at a family gathering at my in-laws, and I was just sitting there on a Saturday, overstuffed on baked ziti and red wine. I was like, and then the door to the other side opened. I have no other way of describing it. And in walked my two main characters. I said, hello, how are you? They introduced themselves, and away we were. But then you need to have it read. I think the most important thing when you write is you have to be willing to devour your young and say things need to be changing. So you need a table reading. And just actors are not acting per se, but they're going to read your script so you can hear it, especially in theater. And then you need to find a venue. And one of the problems in New York is that because of the pandemic, there were a number of theaters, independent theaters, that closed. And that's, it's increasingly Broadway or really downtown. And people forget that it is all the small theaters that bring productions or ideas uptown. I mean, not as much as, because don't get me started about Broadway and all the endless revivals and, the big budget musicals. And then you need to find a place, either you're going to rent it, you do an equity showcase, for example. You can do that, you could, with not a lot of money, but it's still going to cost money. You're going to lose money. I'm fortunate because the Tank Theater is a wonderful theater. In fact, they won an Obie Award for the way they promote the arts in New York City. And they accepted us, and they gave us a lot, like the theater and the rehearsal space and front of house. And then I put together the team, and I'm blessed because I have a wonderful director, Marcello Rolando. As I mentioned, I have Russell Jordan and Rosalind Seal, J. Dolan Burns is playing Albie Sands, Matt Provenza playing Mitchell Reed, and Marina Rebecca Chan playing Jay and Pham. And they're just wonderfully talented and gifted, and they understand what the play's about, which isn't to say there's a right or wrong, but they're open about the play.
It's interesting with a play that it's so interactive, right? I mean, with a book, you're writing, and then that's, you know, you have editors, but it's different, I suppose, with a play that how much say or sway do perhaps the actors or a director or a producer have over a work that you've written?
I give them a lot, because otherwise, why am I writing a play? I write dystopian political novels, but as you're absolutely right, it's just me. It's my name on it, good or bad. There's no one to play and we'll get the credit. But the beauty of theater is the collaboration. And then you see things that you never thought of. And they say, well, the writer must have meant this. And you're like, well, I know. I wish I knew about that. And, you know, I write a little more stage directions than I should. Not terrible, but a little more. And the director says, no, we're going to do it differently. And it's great. The different things. Then, of course, there's the blocking on stage, which is, we're in our second week of rehearsals now. And you would forget where they're walking around and where they're turning and looking. It's all staged. It's got to be locked down. Then I just go, oh, I'm going to walk there. No, and it's a wonderful process to watch a play come to life and to see actors imbue your characters. I mean, the characters lived up here. When I write characters, I usually don't physically see them. It sounds weird. I mean, I might describe them, but I don't say, oh, that they're like, you know, I don't see them as like 5'9", 150. You know, I don't really see this. So when you see actors take over, and then bring their own stuff to it, their own backstories, their own humanity, it's fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I mean, it must be, I suppose, when you see it produced and the first time through, I suppose you might be surprised in some ways, just as much as somebody who's never experienced the piece that way.
Yes. Oh, and you don't know what the audience is going to laugh at. I've been there where you think, why aren't you laughing? That's a funny line. And, you know, everyone's, but then something you didn't think was funny, people were roaring about. And then, of course, as a playwright, you have to understand the silence, because silence doesn't mean people are sleeping. Silence means they're listening. Sometimes that's the greatest sound of all in a theater. They're paying strict attention to what's going on, and they're part of it. They've accepted this world. They've stepped into it with the actors.
Yeah, it is interesting to think of silence. I suppose it's something that would sort of shake somebody who's not experienced with a stage production, or is sort of waiting for a constant reaction. But yeah, it's interesting to think of how the silence is. You know, you were talking before about a table read and silence, and how that might play in there too, where sort of as much as you can hear it in yourself, when you hear somebody else's voice on the lines, how much that might affect an editing process, or just thinking through a problem or making something better.
Because sometimes it just doesn't work. It's simple as that. The line doesn't work. The exchange doesn't work. Usually because it's too wordy. You're just overcompensating to say it. Then the actors will say, I don't understand this, which is great. Because if they don't understand it, the audience is going to be confused. And that's why you want them. And you have to be willing, like I said, to listen and make the edits. I mean, that's writing in a nutshell. Everyone has a good story. Fine, go write it. But then once you're going to write it, first of all, you got to write. And you have to deal with the blank page every day. But then you have to be willing to work at it and edit it and say, wow, this is rubbish. How did I ever write this?
Yeah, I often think, I teach writing classes and things. And oftentimes what I tell the students is, if one person doesn't like it, it might be good, it might be bad. But if 3 people tell you that it's a problem, you're probably wrong and they're probably right. You know, at some point you have to have that humility to be able to say, I was probably wrong. You know, I'm wrong, and probably the people are right who are asking the questions and pointing things out to me.
Well, yeah, because you're kind of a little schizo here, because on the one hand, you have this godlike vision. Oh, this is my world. I've created this and everything. And the other hand, you're neurotic and insecure. Oh, I don't know. Is it really any good? You know, and there's a reason why people become writers. We're a little different. That's it. I mean, that's just how it is. My mother had told me a story when I was in first grade. The teacher called to the class, which was never a good thing back in those days. You know, it was like, oh, what has happened? And the teacher pointed through the window from the hallway into the classroom. And there I was with pencils, making up stories and calling things out and everything. And the teacher said, I don't want to restrain or suppress his creativity, but the class is watching him more than they're watching me. You know, I mean, that's, you know, the kid who played with pencils, we're all like that. We all tell stories for various reasons. You grow up in an unhappy home. You want to find a way to create an alternative world where it's not so unhappy. That's nothing, you know, so unusual about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. You were talking before about how you don't see the characters necessarily and this idea of story. So with a play, this one happened to start with characters. Do you find that it's easier to start with characters? Do you find it's easier to start with a plot, or how do you think of, or is just whatever comes to you in the moment?
I think it's the characters. Ultimately, the characters have to do it. You could have a notion of an idea. You know, I had a notion kind of, well, I would like to write something about a story about anti-Semitism, but I had no idea what the story was. And then there they were. But I think when you try to write something plot, you're making your characters follow the plot, and it should never be that way. The characters must always, even action movies, right? It's the character who decides if they're going to be able to jump from rooftop to rooftop, right? Right? It's silly enough, but it's true. And so I think you really always have to defer to your characters. And writers will say this, and it sounds terribly precious, but it's true. Philip K. Dick always talked about this. Of course, he was crazy, but that's just besides the fact. That characters will take over your writing. They are, you know, and you're, oh, well, come on. You know, they're in your head. Well, not really. In a strange sense, they're not. And they will change the scene. You always try to start a scene with some idea where you want. But they'll say, you know what, schmuck, I wouldn't say that. What's wrong with you? And it's a very odd experience, but you have to let it happen. You can't, you know, fight against it. You should have a plot, but the plot it's always good if you have some idea where you're going to end up. I usually have some idea, but I really have very little idea how I'm going to get there, because that's the fun journey, usually fun.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about with so like, you know, Charles Dickens used to lay out his entire book basically in an outline, and then he would fill in details. Whereas somebody like there are other schools of thought where as soon as you know where you're going, you're supposed to stop writing and then wait till you don't know where you're going and start again. That would be Hemingway's sort of approach to writing. So it's interesting to think about how there's some middle ground there where, like, you know, the characters enough where the characters will lead you through the details, but they'll still do the leading, and you sort of just let them take those reins and bring you through the story.
Yes, because at the end of the day, the reader, the viewer, they want the character. That's it. That's who they identify. When you read a novel, you identify with the character. You remember the character, and that's what you should never, at your own peril, you forget that. Which I think in too many Hollywood movies now, as I said before, they've forgotten that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see people rely on archetype, but not feeling, again, those like specific details that would build something unique and specific, where you would be able to grasp, you know, a really good character versus just a kind of general ideology or character, you know, that doesn't really have the same meat on its bones.
No, and there are writers, of course, who write their avatars, and I don't. I always believed, and the more I write, the less I really do that. As often as not, I don't always agree with my characters. Sometimes I'm offended. Their behavior appalls me sometimes, but that's who they are. It's not about me. My beliefs, my politics, it's completely irrelevant. It's just what the characters do. And you have to be willing to have characters who sometimes behave badly. We all behave badly at some point. We're human beings. We're not perfect.
Yeah, something that I think stymied me for like years was I kept writing myself on a page, which is a
Yeah,
terrible,
well,
like, you know, and that idea of catharsis. And then it's like, is that really art? I think when you get to write about other people or characters in general that are not you per se, you know, obviously you infuse a little bit of yourself. That I think that's just natural. But the idea of allowing for the characters again to be outside of you, something else that really does free up the writing so that it actually works rather than just being, you know, 15 different ways that you see yourself, kind of.
yes, absolutely. You have to be able to do that. You really have to step back and really take yourself out of the story. Yes, there's always going to be a little bit of you somewhere, but you really have to just create distinct characters, and you have to create people who are flawed, but not villainous necessarily. I mean, in a black and white cookie, I have a couple characters who have prejudiced views, one a little stronger than the other, but they're nice people. They would rush to the aid. If they saw a Jewish person on the street being attacked, they'd be the first one there to defend them. So it's you have to find that balance and that complexity and sometimes the contradictions of people. And you gotta, you know, in theater, you must have an arc. Your characters must go somewhere. I remember when I first gave a black and white cookie to this producer, and she said, boy, your characters have developed. I said, well, of course. She said, well, you'd be surprised how many people, their characters remain static. And that's, then where have you seen the journey?
Yeah. No, it's interesting to see how people will sort of think about, you know, manipulating things at the end of the day, trying to create something new. But at the end of the day, there are some fundamentals probably that can't be messed with, you know, the character being the primary and dealing with characters perhaps that you don't like. It's interesting to think about, you know, you were talking before about anti-Semitism, and you're sort of like the Nazi on the stage sort of gives its own vibe. But it's interesting to think of people who have written Nazis in the past and how one does undertake such an endeavor to humanize a Nazi, you know, and especially within perhaps a Jewish sort of setting or with Jewish characters involved.
Well, you know, let's think about how Jews are often depicted, which is something that's, you know, I find very interesting. My play, Black Tomato Can't Grow in the Bronx, which is actually going to open in December at the Chain Theater. And it's about, like I said, a working class family. And a couple of characters, two of the male characters, they're union guys. And when we were at Center Players in Freehold, New Jersey, and we had talkbacks. We had sold out all 6 shows, and then they had another. We sold that out. There's a waiting list. Anyway, so after the talkback, people saying they identify with the family and blah, blah, blah. And then people would say, what? I didn't know there were tough Jews. Well, you know, I say you should probably talk to the 100 million Arabs who have been dealing with Israel. But you think about how are Jews in popular entertainment, in theater, movies, TV, often depicted? Well, we're depicted as nebbishes, orthodontists, and going to your point about the Nazis, all too often victims. I mean, what is the most popular Jewish-themed movie, say, of the last 30 years was Schindler's List? Well, you know, I'm going to guess anecdotally that the most produced Jewish-themed play, other than Fiddler on the Roof, would be Anne Frank. And these are depictions, these are characters, these are themes almost always produced and created by Jews. So you have to think about that. And how healthy is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think of, right, what you're saying before, like you wouldn't have a Jewish pride movement, but there is sort of almost the opposite, which is like don't look at us too hard, or
yes,
obfuscation of perhaps what we're capable of in an interesting way.
Yes, well, and that goes back to the early days of Hollywood, when 6 of the 7 studios, except for Disney, were all Jewish run, and you could understand coming from the old country, fleeing persecution, the 20s and 30s. They were, leery. They wanted to assimilate. All immigrants at that point wanted to assimilate, and there was some pushback from certain segments of the press, but they lay low. And, in the 30s into the 40s, the only movie to take on Hitler, to make fun of Hitler, was The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin. Most people probably thought he was Jewish, There was The Mortal Storm with Jimmy Stewart, where they never mentioned Jew, just non-Aryan. In fact, Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck, which is based on the Laura Hobson novel, in 1947, who won the Oscar for Best Picture. It was about anti-Semitism among the upper class in Connecticut. Okay, but the Hollywood studio owners did not want that made. They tried to stop it, and they gave it to the only, well, at that time, the only not at the time, Darryl F. Zanuck ran Fox. So they said, well, you have to produce it. We can't have a Jew produce that. Now, this is 1947, 2 years after the Holocaust. And then you think, well, it took 1960 for Exodus, which actually talked about the camps, or 1961 was and in 1960, the lead character was Paul Newman, though his father was Jewish, he was certainly not identified as a Jew, and he always said he regretted taking that role. And Judgment in Nuremberg, Stanley Kramer actually, took on in more detail. But so we've always kind of been shy. Now, I don't know if it's like, a shanda for the goyim, it's, we don't want to draw attention to ourselves, but we have to be out there too. And I don't know why Jews can't take pride as other people.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, part of what we're trying to accomplish, I guess, would be to allow for that. I'm not sure I don't know what the psychology of it is. I can't tell if it's a post-Holocaust kind of thing, a pre-Holocaust thing, a general Ashkenazi Jew kind of. I mean, if you talk to like Ashkenazi Jews, that does seem to be the theme. Whereas you talk to more Sephardic Jews, they're less concerned. And it's an interesting comment on sort of the last 1,000 years in Eastern Europe and how Jews were sort of treated there versus perhaps the Arabic land, and how that does to the psyche, and how we sort of process that through time. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I do know that ideally we would get to that place where we could sort of just say, I think today or yesterday, it's a very strange thing to like put out that fact that you're a Jew. I work in a public school, so it's like, yeah, it just feels very strange to just say, well, I'm Jewish, and that's just what it is. Whereas, I don't hide it per se. I'm not like ashamed of it, but it is not perhaps the first thing that I identify with, at any given point in my day, which is interesting.
Yes, well, but that's a very sad statement that you would even feel that way, that there would be any sort of pressure or anything. I mean, we could identify just like anyone else. We don't have to be superior. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that, but we have the same rights. We have certainly a rich legacy. And I think sometimes we do what I would call like the Jewish step and fetch it. I mean, I still cringe when, I don't know if you're a science fiction fan, but in Independence Day, when the Judd Hirsch portrayals of Jeff Goldblum's father, where he was talking like he just got off the boat at Ellis Island, what was that about? It was like every cliche. And sometimes we default to the cliches because we think that's what's expected. That's what the Gentile world, how they want to see Jews, that they're not comfortable with tough Jews. But it's the Jews who are making that decision. Seinfeld, for example, of the 4 lead actors, 3 were Jewish, only one was a Jewish character on the show, Jerry. Jason Alexander, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, both Jewish, both the characters on the show were not Jewish.
Yeah, I'm trying to think the most, I would say, tough Jews, I would say would be Inglourious Bastards. Forget when it came out.
Loved it.
Maybe 6 years ago. That was like the only, trying to like think of any
Quentin Tarantino, a non-Jew.
Right. That is true.
Right? Think about that.
And he still has Brad Pitt as sort of the lead, leading the Jews. So it's not, a Jew leading Jews per se. But it is interesting to think that that's probably in the last, for as long as I can remember, the most, tough Jews just doing what they need to do kind of film. And I don't think there's any other sort of, maybe in Israel they're producing things, but I think that also comes back to that idea of like how Jews and Israel sort of coincide and how the politics of that looks. So that probably has something to do with how we do or do not own our own sort of titles or confidence within ourselves, depending on how the political spectrum sees perhaps the tie between those entities and identities.
Well, with the anti-Zionism on the rise, which is not really anti-Zionism, but as all too often a stalking horse for anti-Semitism. Israel's no longer the underdog, has not been for a long time. Who's going to make a movie? Who's going to want to see a movie glorifying the IDF? Right? I mean, I watch, Israel does some wonderful TV shows on Netflix. Do you ever see Fauda?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I mean, it's wonderful, but it's gray. They're pretty tough, but at least it's a great gray morality. That's fine. Just don't show us as nevishes. You don't have to show Jewish super people who never make mistakes. That's ridiculous. But show us, remember that movie maybe 5-6 years ago, Uncut Gems with Adam Sandler?
Yes, yeah.
That's a really good movie. And I'm not a big Adam Sandler fan, but I thought that was the best role he's ever done. But it was because he was so flawed. And you think about it, how often do Jewish creatives make plays, entertainment about flawed Jewish characters as well?
Yeah. I think that film, the Safdie brothers, right, did that film. I think that they're Jewish as well. So it is interesting. Perhaps as we sort of move through, it's interesting. I think a lot about like the 20th century, perhaps this is an oversimplification, but like the Potok type of writer versus the Philip Roth type of writer. And Philip Roth was definitely of the apologize for the Judaism thing, whereas Potok was a much more, I'm Jewish and that's just, I live in the world. So it's an interesting sort of like paradigm around how different Jewish artists see their own Jewish identity within their work. And
I understand why it was in those days and how hard it is. And I respect the trailblazing of Philip Roth, who I loved, and Saul Bellow and people like that. But even two of my favorite playwrights are Patty Chayefsky and Arthur Millen. And Patty Chayefsky, the wonderful teleplay, which was a movie, Marty, it was about an Italian butcher in the Bronx, not a Jew. The Arcaded Affair, the great movie with Bette Davis about an Irish family, not a Jewish family. It's interesting. There was a self-censorship out of fear that people would not want to see that. And so the question is, I mean, and minorities go through this. We know that. I mean, it's unfortunate. It's terrible. But we can't do that anymore. And I don't think you see, I mean, some of my plays, like Tomato Can't Grow in the Bronx, is kind of old school. You don't see, plays about bickering Jewish families anymore. Why not?
Yeah. I don't know.
Yes.
Hopefully we get more. It's interesting thinking of I have to ask about the title of your play. I mean, obviously there's the black and white cookie, the literal, why that title, how that title sort of.
It just popped into my head. I wish I could say something brilliant. Sometimes when you write, sometimes it just pops into your head.
Yeah.
No one, God did not press his finger on your head. It's just, it sounded good. Okay, fine.
No, I'm with you. Sometimes that's just the way it goes.
Yes.
And titles to me, I find are sort of, I think some people start with titles. I always found it hard I think titles like the last thing I'll do. I don't know how you feel about a title versus the work.
Yes.
But for me, I can't do it first. It just ruins it.
Yes.
It kind of boxes you into to the plot taking over rather than allowing the story develop through a character.
Yes. I usually pop the titles first. That helps me a little bit. It focuses me a little bit. But again, as I said, ultimately it's what the characters are going to say. And it doesn't, there's nothing wrong with having Jewish themes as long as it's not just about the Jewish themes. I'm a great believer in writing about characters who happen to be, because we happen to be a lot of things. And in our case, Jews is just one of the things. I mean, I think, I happen to believe that our families had way more impact on us, right? And, we live in a society where there's so many boxes to check. We have to remember we're just people. And I think that's what, when you write plays, that's what you really have to push. That even though I'm this and you're that, we're still human beings, and we've got to find a way to come together. And I think now more than ever in our society, artists need to show the way forward. You can show dark and edgy in my plays, show that, but ultimately, you've got to give some path. You've got to give some hope.
Agreed. I think that is sort of always the message. And so in order to get it, a black and white cookie is going to be at the Tank July 9th, right? Is when it's opening.
July 9th to 24th, yes.
Excellent. And they can get tickets at the tanknyc.org.
Yes.
Anywhere else they should be looking? We can find you on social media. How else?
Ed Writer on Twitter, Ed Writer Gary, and on Facebook, whatever it is. On Facebook. Perfect.